Hey guys, tonight we ride straight into the wind. You're sitting low on a horse that knows the land better than any map, the steppe opening around you like an ocean made of grass, and somewhere in the soft creak of leather and wood, there's silk, real silk, folded into a saddlebag, brushing against your fingers when you reach down without thinking. It's warmer than you expect, softer than wool, and absolutely not what your brain associates with nomads who live under felt tents and follow animals for a living. You probably won't survive this story with your neat little ideas about civilized fabric versus primitive life intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what your local time is. The steppe loves knowing how far its echoes travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move with the caravan as if you've always done this. The camels sway, the horses snort, and the people around you, Scythians, Sogdians, Turkic nomads, depending on the century you squint at, treat silk not as a luxury display item, but as a practical, meaningful material. Mainstream history likes to tell you silk belongs to imperial China, locked behind secrets and palace walls, and that part is true. The Chinese state guarded sericulture fiercely for centuries, but historians also agree that by at least the first millennium BCE, silk threads and finished textiles were already traveling far beyond China, turning up in Central Asian burials, sometimes wrapped around bodies that had never seen a mulberry grove. That's your first hint that the story isn't about origin, but about adoption. You feel the contradiction immediately. Nomads move constantly. Silk sounds fragile, and yet here it is, stitched into garments meant for riding, trading, and surviving temperature swings that go from freezing nights to sunburned afternoons. A quirky detail that doesn't get enough love, silk is actually an excellent insulator when layered, and it breathes better than many plant fibers. Nomads noticed this fast. Silk under wool reduced chafing on long rides and helped regulate body heat. This isn't decadence, it's field-tested comfort. Think medieval athleisure minus the influencer. As you ride, stories circulate as freely as goods. Someone tells you about silk arriving as tribute, bolts paid by Chinese courts to keep borders calm. Someone else insists it came as loot after a raid, cut down from banners and redistributed. Historians still argue whether Central Asian nomads primarily encountered silk as diplomatic currency or as trade merchandise first, and the answer probably shifts depending on which tribe, which century, and who happened to be winning that year. The steppe has never been a single storyline, no matter how much textbooks want it to behave. You notice how silk changes hands. It's weighed, folded, inspected against the light. People check for tightness of weave, not embroidery. This isn't about dragons or imperial motifs yet. Early nomadic use often stripped silk down to its material value. A plain weave could be cut, reinforced, combined with wool or leather. There's even archaeological evidence, yes, this part is solid, that silk thread was used to repair felt and hide because it was strong and flexible. The fringe tidbit here is that some scholars suspect silk thread was prized less for how it looked and more for how rarely it snapped when wet. If you've ever tried sewing in bad weather, you feel that appreciation in your bones. The landscape keeps rolling by, and you realize silk also travels as an idea. You hear people arguing about whether silk softens a culture, whether it seduces warriors into comfort. That anxiety shows up later in Persian and Chinese writings too, accusing steppe elites of becoming too luxurious. Light joke break. Congratulations, silk has been blamed for moral decay for over 2,000 years. Beats blaming smartphones, honestly. But from where you're sitting, silk doesn't make anyone weaker. It just makes long journeys more bearable. There's a quiet hierarchy forming around silk that you pick up on without anyone spelling it out. Certain patterns, certain colors are reserved, not by law, but by understanding.
This is where the seeds of later weaving traditions are planted, even before looms enter the picture in earnest. Silk scraps are saved, reused, inherited. They become markers of connection to a successful trade route, a remembered ancestor, a past winter survived. Historians still argue whether these early uses count as a silk tradition or merely opportunistic recycling. But standing here, feeling how carefully the material is handled, that debate feels a little academic. Night falls and the camp settles. Silk glints faintly in firelight, not loud, not flashy, just present. You realize this section of the journey isn't about how silk is made yet. It's about how silk arrives, how it's understood, and how nomadic life reshapes its meaning before a single loom is unpacked. The steppe doesn't care where something comes from. It cares whether it works. And as you lie back, listening to wind slide over grass like a low tide, you already sense that this thread, this improbable, shimmering thread, is about to be pulled through everything that comes next.
You wake before sunrise because animals always do, and because silk, tucked beneath wool, has kept you just warm enough that the cold doesn't shock you into resentment. As the camp stirs, you start noticing the quieter partnerships that make nomadic silk possible. Alliances that don't look like alliances at all. Sheep dominate the landscape, sure, but silk slips in sideways, piggybacking on systems built for wool. Mainstream history agrees that Central Asian nomads were master pastoralists long before they were textile specialists, and that's exactly why silk survives here. It adapts itself to a wool-first world instead of trying to replace it. You watch women and men sorting fibers, and you realize silk rarely appears alone. It's blended, layered, reinforced. Wool gives bulk and resilience. Silk gives smoothness and tensile strength. This isn't aesthetic experimentation for fun, it's engineering. A historically solid fact, archaeological textiles from sites like the Tarim Basin show silk-wool blends dating back over 2,000 years, proving that hybrid fabrics weren't a medieval innovation, but an early, deliberate choice. You can almost hear the weavers saying, "Why choose when you can combine?" Then there's the biological curveball. Nomads don't raise silkworms in the Chinese imperial sense. No neat mulberry orchards, no climate-controlled rooms, but silk still flows. One quirky tidbit that sounds fake but isn't, wild silk, produced by non-domesticated silkworm species, was known and used across Central and South Asia. These cocoons were tougher, less uniform, and harder to process, but nomads valued them because they didn't require settled agriculture. Historians still argue whether wild silk played a significant role in early nomadic weaving, or whether it was mostly a supplement to imported Chinese silk, and the debate gets surprisingly heated for something involving caterpillars. You hear practical talk around the fire. Wool shrinks when wet. Silk doesn't, not the same way. Silk resists mildew better. Silk dries faster. Someone jokes, there's your first light one, that silk is basically the original performance fabric. And suddenly you're imagining steppe warriors advertising moisture-wicking underlayers, which honestly isn't that far off. The humor masks a serious point. Nomads evaluate materials by lived experience, not by prestige labels. Animals shape this relationship in unexpected ways. Sheep provide lanolin-rich wool that naturally repels water. When silk threads are wrapped or stitched into wool garments, they inherit some of that protection. Camels enter the scene too, their hair sometimes mixed with silk for trade-grade textiles. And horses. Horses don't provide fiber, but they dictate everything else. Riding demands flexibility. Seams that rub wrong can injure skin, and injured riders slow caravans. Silk thread, smooth and strong, reduces friction at stress points. That's not romance, that's logistics. You start noticing how silk circulates as fragments rather than bolts, small quantities, carefully guarded. A strip of silk might be enough to edge a collar, reinforce a boot,
or mark status without screaming it. This fragmentation supports another mainstream fact. Nomadic economies favored portability and modular wealth. Silk fits this perfectly. It's light, valuable, divisible. You can trade a little without giving up everything. Light joke number 2. It's basically the step equivalent of breaking a large bill when no one has change. There's also imitation, and it's clever. You see wool spun finer and finer, dyed to mimic silk's sheen. Some groups deliberately blur the line between fibers, creating textiles that look silk-rich but aren't. This isn't fraud, it's adaptation. Silk is rare, wool is abundant. Blend them and you stretch resources. Historians still argue whether these imitations were meant to deceive traders or simply to satisfy local tastes shaped by exposure to silk. And again, the answer probably depends on who's doing the buying. The social layer thickens. Silk threads sometimes mark marriage garments, stitched into wool dresses as symbols of connection beyond the tribe, links to distant roots, distant peoples. You catch a whispered belief that silk carries foreign luck, that it has traveled so far it brings stories with it. Fringe? Maybe, but belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes tradition. There are taboos, too. Silk shouldn't be cut on certain days, shouldn't touch the ground unnecessarily. These rules aren't written, but they're enforced with raised eyebrows and long memories. Your third light joke slips in when someone complains that silk attracts envy faster than flies to kumis. And honestly, that's social psychology doing laps around the campfire. Scarcity creates tension. Silk's presence sharpens awareness of inequality, even in societies that pride themselves on shared hardship. But instead of banning it, nomads manage it through blending, redistribution, and controlled display. As the day stretches on, you realize this section of the story isn't about silkworms versus sheep. It's about ecosystems overlapping. Silk doesn't conquer wool, it negotiates with it. It finds niches where it matters most: skin contact, seams, symbols. The steppe absorbs silk the same way it absorbs people, selectively, pragmatically, and on its own terms. By evening, as garments are folded and animals settle, silk disappears again beneath layers, doing its quiet work. You don't see it, but you feel it. And that, you suspect, is exactly how nomadic silk traditions survive, by being useful enough to keep, subtle enough not to disrupt, and strange enough to be remembered.
You don't notice the loom at first because it doesn't announce itself. There's no grand frame, no workshop smell, no sense of permanence. It's just a bundle of wood, bone, and cord leaning against a cart like it might roll away at any moment, which, honestly, it probably will. This is where your assumptions finally give up. Mainstream history agrees that Central Asian nomads used portable looms, backstrap looms, ground looms, narrow warp setups, precisely because fixed architecture wasn't an option. And yet here you are, watching silk threads stretched into order in the middle of nowhere, the horizon doing absolutely nothing to help. You squat down and see how it works. Stakes are driven into the earth, or sometimes tied to saddles or carts. One end of the warp is literally attached to a person's body. Weaving becomes a negotiation between tension and movement, between breath and balance. Silk behaves differently than wool here. It's slick, less forgiving. One wrong pull and the whole thing goes slack. The weaver adjusts instinctively, leaning back, shifting weight, making micro corrections that no diagram could ever teach. Historians still argue whether nomadic silk weaving was mostly learned through direct instruction or through embodied imitation, children absorbing technique just by watching backs bend and hands move. But watching this, you suspect the body learns before the brain ever labels it. A historically grounded fact slips in quietly. Excavations across Central Asia have revealed loom weights, spindles, and weaving tools in nomadic burial contexts, proving that textile production wasn't outsourced entirely to settled neighbors. These people didn't just trade for cloth, they made it. And the looms themselves were designed to disappear. When it's time to move, the warp is cut, rolled, or sometimes left unfinished on purpose to be resumed later. Silk fits this rhythm surprisingly well. Narrow bands, trims, and panels are easier to transport than broad cloth, and nomadic silk traditions lean into that constraint instead of fighting it. There's a quirky tidbit that always makes modern textile folks blink. Some nomadic weavers intentionally wove silk slightly unevenly, introducing subtle irregularities, not mistakes, signatures, a way to mark authorship or ward off envy, depending on who you ask. Historians still argue whether these irregularities were symbolic, practical, or just the natural outcome of portable looms and variable tension, but the weavers themselves don't seem especially concerned with the argument. The cloth holds. That's what matters. You notice how time behaves around the loom. Weaving happens in pauses, between migrations, between meals, between animal care. Silk isn't rushed. It can't be. Wool forgives speed. Silk demands patience. Someone jokes, light joke number 1, that silk knows when you're in a bad mood and will punish you for it, which gets a few nods that feel a little too sincere. Mood matters. Weather matters. Even gossip matters, because distraction leads to mistakes. Gender roles slide into focus here, not rigidly but clearly. Women dominate silk weaving in many nomadic groups, though men participate in setup, dyeing, and trade. Mainstream scholarship agrees that textile knowledge often equaled economic power, and you feel that dynamic humming under the surface. Control the loom, control the cloth. Control the cloth, control what moves between families, clans, and caravans. This isn't domestic busywork, it's infrastructure. Silk threads are handled differently from wool. They're stored wrapped around bones, sticks, even arrow shafts. Protection from tangling is everything. You watch someone lick their fingers before guiding silk through heddles, saliva as lubricant, a small human hack passed down without ceremony. Fringe detail, but very real. Another debate bubbles up here. Historians still argue whether nomadic silk techniques influenced later settled weaving traditions in Central Asia, or whether influence mostly flowed the other way. Standing here, watching techniques optimized for mobility, it's hard not to suspect the influence ran both directions, tangled like the threads themselves. Light joke number 2 lands when someone complains that silk is too smart for its own good, slipping out of knots like it's alive. And honestly, silk does feel almost animate, responding to humidity, temperature, touch. That sensitivity makes portable looms tricky, but also expressive. Patterns emerge slowly. Stripes, chevrons, repeating motifs small enough to survive interruption. Large pictorial designs are rare here. Portability favors abstraction. You realize that the loom itself becomes part of the social space. People talk while weaving. Stories are timed to rows. Certain tales are told only when silk is on the loom, believed to set into the fabric. Is that superstition? Maybe, but belief shapes process. Historians still argue whether ritual storytelling during weaving had measurable cultural impact or was merely accompaniment. Yet those arguments fade when you see how memory and motion synchronize. As afternoon slides toward evening, the loom begins to vanish again. Stakes pulled, threads secured, everything bundles back into motion. The silk panel isn't finished, but that's normal. Completion is a flexible concept here. Light joke number 3 sneaks in when someone says the loom travels more than most people do, which feels true in a way that makes you smile. You step back and understand something crucial. Nomadic silk weaving isn't a compromised version of real weaving. It's a different solution to a different problem. How do you make something delicate survive a life defined by movement? You make the tools move too. You make the patterns adaptable. You let the loom breathe. And as the caravan prepares to leave again, silk packed away mid-sentence, mid-row, you realize the loom hasn't disappeared at all. It's just waiting, folded into the rhythm of travel, ready to reappear wherever the ground pauses long enough to listen.
Morning smells different today, sharper, earthier. You catch it before you see it, the bite of fermenting roots, the faint sweetness of crushed berries, the smoky undertone that clings to clothes long after the fire dies. This is dye day, and silk, for once, is going to be loud. Mainstream history backs this up. Central Asian nomads were highly skilled dyers, using local plants, insects, and minerals to achieve colors that traveled just as far as the cloth itself. The steppe looks muted from a distance, but kneel down and it's practically shouting pigment at you. You crouch beside a pot that's been blackened by years of use. Inside, liquid shifts from brown to something deeper as heat builds. Silk skeins hover nearby, pale and expectant. Unlike wool, silk drinks dye fast and remembers it well. That's both a gift and a risk. One wrong ratio and the color goes muddy, uneven, embarrassing. Someone mutters that silk has no patience for amateurs, which earns a quiet laugh, light joke number one, because everyone here knows exactly how unforgiving this moment is. A solid historical fact threads in. Madder root, used for reds, was widespread across Central Asia, producing everything from soft pinks to deep blood-warm crimson, depending on preparation. Indigo came through trade, but local substitutes, woad-like plants, filled the gaps. Yellow came from onion skins, chamomile, or wildflowers you'd never notice unless you were taught to look. And then there's cochineal's cousin, scale insects harvested from shrubs, crushed carefully to release reds that feel almost too rich for the landscape. Fringe detail, but true. Some nomadic groups believed insects produced stronger colors because they had already survived the harshness of the steppe. You watch how silk is handled separately. Wool can be stirred, bullied, shoved around. Silk is lowered gently, turned with sticks, lifted to breathe. It gleams differently with every pass. Historians still argue whether nomadic dyers achieved consistent color standards or embraced variation as part of the aesthetic, and the answer is probably yes to both. Uniformity matters for trade. Variation matters for identity. You see both happening at once. Smoke plays a role too. Silk dyed near open fires absorbs more than color. It takes on scent. Some weavers prefer this, believing smoke sets the dye and deters insects. Others avoid it, swearing it dulls brightness. No one's running controlled experiments here, but preferences are strong. Light joke number two slips in when someone says you can always tell who died near the fire because their clothes smell like last winter, which gets a few snorts and zero denials. Color choices aren't random. Certain shades signal age, status, or readiness for marriage. Deep reds and blues carry weight. Pale tones suggest youth or mourning, depending on the group. Mainstream scholarship agrees that color symbolism varied widely across Central Asia, but silk amplified those meanings because it caught light so dramatically. A dyed wool sleeve is noticed. A dyed silk trim is remembered. You notice the water sources too. Dye vats are set near streams when possible, but never upstream from animals. Practical, yes, but also ritualized. Polluting water brings bad luck. Silk, especially, shouldn't be dyed in angry water, fast-moving, turbulent flows, believed to twist color unpredictably. Historians still argue whether such beliefs originated from practical observation or symbolic cosmology. But standing here, watching how carefully water is chosen, the distinction feels unnecessary. There's improvisation everywhere. When plants are scarce, dyers reuse old baths, layering colors to stretch resources. Silk takes these layers beautifully. A yellow base overdyed with blue gives green that shifts with light. Someone calls it travel color because it looks different at dawn, noon, and dusk. Light joke number 3 lands when someone says silk can't make up its mind what color it wants to be, which honestly feels accurate. You start seeing how dyeing becomes communal knowledge. Recipes aren't written, they're remembered through taste, smell, timing. A finger dipped, a drop flicked onto dirt to watch it spread. Children hover, learning without being taught. Mistakes become lessons, sometimes painfully expensive ones when silk is involved. There's a quiet tension during dyeing that you haven't felt elsewhere. Wool failures are annoying, silk failures are personal. Trade pressure creeps in here too. Certain colors sell better along certain routes. Sogdian traders prefer saturated hues. Steppe elites favor darker, restrained tones. Silk dyed incorrectly can lose value fast. Historians still argue whether trade demands homogenized nomadic dye palettes over time, or whether nomads successfully resisted standardization by leaning into regional color identities. You suspect it's another tug of war with no clean winner. As the silk dries, stretched on lines or laid over grasses, it transforms the camp. Color punctures the neutral world of felt and hide. For a moment, everything looks ceremonial. But the mood doesn't turn precious. People joke, complain, argue about whether a shade leans too purple or too red. This isn't art for art's sake. It's life management with pigment. Evening comes, and the dyed silk is folded carefully, never stacked wet. You notice how people touch it now, with a mix of pride and relief. Color survived. That matters. Silk remembers this day, the plants, the smoke, the water, and will carry it wherever it goes next. As the fire dies down, hues deepen, shadows soften, and the camp returns to its quieter callet. But you know better now. The steppe isn't colorless, it's just selective. And when silk passes through it, the land leaves its mark, stain by stain, memory by memory. You start seeing patterns before anyone points them out, which is how you know you're finely tuned into the language of this place. They repeat across garments, saddle covers, bags, and tent hangings, never perfectly identical, never casually random. Lines bend, hooks mirror, diamonds stretch, and tiny motifs march in disciplined rows before breaking into something more playful. These aren't decorations, they're sentences written in thread. Mainstream history agrees that among Central Asian nomads, textile patterns acted as identifiers, marking clan, lineage, and migration routes in societies where written records weren't central to daily life. Silk, with its crisp edges and luminous surface, becomes the perfect page for this silent script. You lean closer, and the logic starts to reveal itself. A zigzag might mark mountains crossed. A repeating diamond can stand for ancestral tents or hearths. Interrupted lines sometimes signal loss, a family split, a death, a route abandoned after a harsh winter. The quirky tidbit here is that some motifs were deliberately designed to confuse wandering spirits, guiding them into visual mazes where they'd get lost and forget to bother the living. Historians still argue whether this belief reflects ancient spiritual practice or a later poetic interpretation layered onto older geometric traditions, but the weavers repeat it like a fact, and that repetition gives it weight. Silk transforms these patterns into something readable from a distance. Wool absorbs light, but silk catches it and throws it back at the sun. Riding past someone, you can read affiliations at a glance, who they are, where they've been, who they're connected to. This isn't fashion, it's navigation in a human landscape. Misreading a pattern could mean mistaking a friend for a rival, which on the steppe is not an error you want to make. Light joke number 1, it's basically the original ID badge, except embroidered by your grandmother. You notice restraint everywhere. Blank spaces between motifs feel intentional, almost philosophical. Negative space is as meaningful as the symbols themselves. Some silk strips carry only one repeated motif, stretched across the entire length, quietly declaring continuity. Mainstream scholars note that nomadic pattern systems prioritized legibility and memory over sheer complexity, and silk supports that goal by making even simple designs feel important. Tradition isn't frozen, though. Younger weavers experiment. They compress motifs, stretch proportions, add subtle flourishes that elders pretend not to notice. There's gentle negotiation in every pattern choice. Historians still argue whether nomadic patterns evolved mainly through Silk Road exposure or through internal innovation cycles, and watching this generational push and pull, you feel both forces at work. Trade bringing new ideas, youth bringing new interpretations, elders anchoring everything with memory. Then someone explains that patterns can function as maps. Certain sequences are woven only after specific journeys. A band might record rivers crossed, deserts endured, alliances made. Silk becomes a travel diary that doesn't need words. Light joke number 2 lands when someone calls it the original travel blog, except you can't monetize it, and the comments are mostly relatives arguing about accuracy. Power dynamics surface quietly. Women control pattern knowledge. Men might recognize motifs, but women decide when and how they appear. That means women control the visual identity of the group. A pattern withheld is a story withheld. Mainstream historians increasingly recognize textiles as historical archives, especially in societies that left few written records, and silk makes those archives luminous, portable, and resilient. There are taboos layered into this system. Certain motifs shouldn't be woven during storms. Others shouldn't be cut unless accompanied by specific words or gestures. Cutting through a motif incorrectly is believed to sever luck, break lineage, or invite misfortune. Is it superstition? Sure, but it also enforces care. Silk is precious, patterns are precious, and ritual slows hands enough to prevent costly mistakes. Historians still argue whether these taboos arose from spiritual belief or economic pragmatism wrapped in myth, and you're starting to suspect the distinction never mattered to the people living it. As evening approaches, someone lays a finished silk strip across their knees. Fingers trace the motifs unconsciously, like reading a familiar story in the dark. Stories surface, jokes follow. Light joke number 3, someone claims they can tell which patterns were woven by impatient people because the lines argue with each other, which earns a few laughs and one very pointed silence. Now the pace shifts. The fire burns lower. The air cools. Voices soften. The patterns lose their sharp contrast in the fading light, turning into whispers rather than declarations. That feels intentional, like the designs know when to speak and when to rest. You feel reassured here. These patterns aren't museum artifacts. They survive because they live on moving bodies, because they adapt, because they're allowed to change without losing meaning. Silk carries memory, but it doesn't fossilize it. It moves. It forgets selectively. It remembers what matters. Breathing around you slows. The wind brushes the grass with a sound that could be fabric being folded somewhere far away. Someone hums low and steady. The silk is folded, not hidden, just brought closer, like a story paused mid-sentence rather than finished. You don't need to decode every symbol. You just need to feel that these threads are thinking, recording, remembering. While the world moves, while people migrate, while roots shift and empires rise and fall, these patterns quietly map lives in thread. And as your eyes grow heavy, the patterns blur into gentle geometry, lines dissolving into the rhythm of your breathing, memory dissolving into calm.
You're back on the move, because of course you are. Patterns don't stay folded for long on the step, and neither does silk. It's traded, gifted, bargained, withheld, revealed, sometimes all in the same afternoon. You feel the shift immediately as the caravan edges closer to a busier route. The air changes, more languages drift through camp, more eyes linger on fabric. Mainstream history is clear on one thing here. Central Asian nomads were not passive middlemen on the Silk Roads. They were active controllers of movement, taxation, protection, and crucially, information. Silk becomes quieter and sharper at the same time. No one waves it around. It appears briefly, like a card played face down. A narrow band emerges from a sleeve. A folded strip rests on a scale stone. Value is assessed not just by weight, but by origin, dye quality, pattern clarity. You realize silk here is currency, but not standardized currency. Its worth flexes depending on who's looking at it. Historians still argue whether nomadic trade power came more from military control of routes or from their deep knowledge of goods and timing. And watching this negotiation unfold, it's hard to separate the two. A solid historical fact anchors you. Sogdian merchants, many of whom lived semi-nomadic lives, dominated long-distance Silk Road trade for centuries, acting as cultural and commercial translators between China, Persia, and the steppe. Nomadic groups didn't just escort caravans, they shaped demand. Certain silk types moved west faster because nomads preferred them first. That preference rippled outward. Silk doesn't just travel routes, it follows taste. There's secrecy now. Techniques aren't openly discussed. You notice hands shielding knots, conversations dropping when outsiders drift close. Some silk is meant to be seen, some is meant to remain mysterious. Fringe but fascinating, certain nomadic groups deliberately introduced tiny errors into trade silk to mark it as steppe-made, not Chinese, a signature only insiders recognized. Historians still argue whether this was intentional branding or a byproduct of portable looms and mixed fibers, but the confidence with which people identify their silk suggests more than accident. You hear talk of tariffs paid in cloth, not coin. Silk strips change hands to guarantee safe passage. A gift of silk smooths tensions faster than livestock ever could, because it doesn't eat, wander, or die unexpectedly. Light joke number 1 lands when someone says silk never runs away at night, which earns a grin and a nod, because that's painfully true. Trade also reshapes production. Certain colors are favored in certain directions. Patterns simplify or intensify depending on destination. Nomadic weavers adjust without ceremony. This isn't selling out, it's survival. Historians still argue whether increased trade diluted traditional nomadic silk aesthetics or provided the very incentive that kept them alive. Standing here, you sense adaptation, not erosion. Silk carries stories too. Rumors of wars, collapsed cities, new rulers. Cloth arrives with news folded into it. A torn edge might mean a bad season. An abundance of bright dye suggests prosperity somewhere far away. Light joke number 2 slips in when someone says you can tell market conditions by how cheerful the silk looks, which sounds silly until you realize it's basically economic forecasting by fabric. Power dynamics sharpen. Nomads decide who trades when. Routes can close. Silk can stall. That leverage matters. Mainstream historians agree that steppe control over movement shaped Eurasian history far more than sedentary empires liked to admit. Silk is both excuse and weapon in that control, valuable enough to fight over, portable enough to disappear. By nightfall, deals conclude quietly. Silk is folded again, tucked into saddlebags, hidden under felt. It has done its work. You realize this section of the journey isn't about glamour or luxury. It's about negotiation, timing, restraint. Silk survives the steppe because it learns when to shine and when to stay silent. As the caravan settles, routes stretching out ahead like half-remembered dreams, you feel how fragile and powerful this network is. A single thread connects distant worlds. And here, on the open grass, that thread is held firmly in nomadic hands.
You start noticing who speaks last in conversations, and it's almost never the loudest voice. Silk has taught you that trick. It draws your attention to hands, not mouths, to who folds it, who stores it, who decides when it appears. Mainstream history increasingly recognizes that in many Central Asian nomadic societies, women held disproportionate influence through control of textiles, and silk sits at the center of that quiet authority. You don't see thrones or councils here. You see looms, bundles, and decisions made without announcement. You watch a negotiation unfold that looks, on the surface, like it's between men. Horses are discussed. Routes debated, but when silk enters the picture, eyes shift sideways. A woman steps forward, not interrupting, just present. She adjusts a fold, exposes a pattern edge, lets the light catch it. The conversation changes tone immediately. That's power. Not dramatic, not performative, just effective.
Historians still argue whether women's textile control translated into formal political authority or remained informal influence. But from where you're standing, the distinction feels academic. Influence that works is power. A solid historical fact grounds this. In many nomadic cultures, textile goods formed part of bride wealth and inheritance systems, giving women ongoing economic leverage long after marriage. Silk, rare and durable, amplified that leverage. It could be passed down, divided, repurposed. You realize silk doesn't just move across space, it moves across generations. Wool wears out, silk lingers. There's a guild-like feel to silk knowledge, even without formal guilds. Techniques are shared selectively. Not everyone learns everything. Certain dye recipes, pattern sequences, or loom tricks stay within families or age groups. The quirky tidbit here is that some women intentionally taught incomplete techniques to outsiders, enough to function, not enough to replicate fully. Historians still argue whether this was conscious protectionism or simply the natural outcome of embodied knowledge that's hard to fully articulate. Watching a lesson trail off mid-explanation, you suspect it's a bit of both. You notice humor woven into authority. Light joke number 1 lands when someone says silk listens better to women than men, which gets a ripple of laughter and exactly 0 objections. Jokes like that reinforce social truths without confrontation. Silk becomes a socially acceptable way to talk about hierarchy without naming it outright. Control extends beyond production into diplomacy. Women decide which silk is gifted to whom. A well-chosen piece can soften rivalries, signal alliance, or quietly insult if done wrong. Color matters, pattern matters, timing matters. Historians still argue whether women's diplomatic roles through textiles were recognized explicitly or simply tolerated, but the results speak clearly. Deals hold, tensions ease. Silk does what words sometimes can't. There's labor here, too, and it's respected. Silk work is slow, demanding, and mentally taxing. You see hands stiff from years of fine manipulation, eyes trained to spot flaws instantly. This labor isn't hidden, it's acknowledged, even if not loudly praised. Mainstream scholars note that in many nomadic groups, productive labor, especially textile labor, was valued more highly than idle status display. Silk reinforces that ethic. You earn respect by making something that lasts. Men participate, but differently. They handle trade, transport, protection. They learn enough about silk to value it correctly, not necessarily to make it. This division isn't rigid, but it's patterned. Historians still argue whether these roles were culturally enforced or simply practical adaptations to nomadic life. And again, the argument dissolves when you watch people doing what needs doing without fuss. Light joke number 2 slips in when someone says silk remembers who rushed it, and that impatience always shows later. It sounds mystical until you think about tension mistakes, dye errors, sloppy joins. Silk does remember, in a way. It records care. Authority deepens with age. Older women hold pattern memory, lineage knowledge, ritual timing. When disputes arise about how it's always been done, eyes turn to them, not for nostalgia, but for precedent. Silk becomes a legal archive. Who wore what, when, and why matters. Mainstream historians increasingly use textile analysis to reconstruct social structures precisely because these details were preserved in cloth when words weren't. There's risk, too. Controlling silk attracts envy. Accusations of favoritism, hoarding, or manipulation surface quietly. Some women downplay their role, redirect credit, spread silk thinner than strictly necessary to maintain harmony. Historians still argue whether this diffused power structure prevented centralized authority among nomads or simply expressed it differently. Watching these careful distributions, you sense strategy, not weakness. Light joke number 3 lands softly when someone says silk causes fewer fights than horses, which gets a tired laugh because it's only mostly true. But the joke carries truth. Silk negotiates where force escalates. As evening settles, you see silk bundled again, placed near sleeping areas, not storage, close, accessible, trusted. It's not locked away because trust here isn't built on locks. It's built on memory and reputation, both of which silk quietly reinforces. You understand now that silk isn't just material culture, it's social architecture. It structures who speaks, who decides, who remembers. Power doesn't always announce itself with banners. Sometimes it hums softly, thread sliding through fingers, shaping outcomes while everyone pretends it's just fabric. And as the camp quiets, you feel how steady that hum is, persistent, practiced, and impossible to ignore once you've learned how to listen.
Night deepens, and with it come the rules that only exist after dark. Silk behaves differently now, quieter, heavier somehow, as if it knows this is when meanings thicken. You sit close enough to the fire to feel warmth, but far enough that shadows can do their work. And this is where rituals creep in. Mainstream history acknowledges that Central Asian nomadic life blended practical knowledge with layers of belief. And silk, sitting at the crossroads of value and vulnerability, attracted more superstition than almost any other material. You're told certain silk should never be woven during storms. Wind knots luck. Thunder startles threads. Is that literal? Probably not. But silk reacts to humidity and tension shifts, and bad weather ruins careful work fast. Historians still argue whether weather-related taboos around silk were symbolic or empirical rules wrapped in myth. But either way, the result is the same: patience enforced by belief. Light joke number 1 slips in when someone says, "The sky hates sloppy weaving too," which gets a soft laugh and a glance upward, just in case. Charms appear, knotted cords, small metal pieces sewn into hems. Some silk bands hide tiny bones or beads between layers, invisible once finished. The quirky tidbit here is that these hidden elements were believed to anchor the silk spirit, preventing it from wandering or attracting misfortune. Fringe? Absolutely, but widespread enough that archaeologists have actually found concealed objects stitched into ancient textiles. Historians still argue whether these inclusions were spiritual safeguards or markers of ownership, and again, the line blurs comfortably. Certain patterns shouldn't be spoken aloud while weaving. Naming them invites attention. Others must be sung into existence, a low chant keeping rhythm with the shuttle. You hear one now, barely audible, words stretching longer than grammar allows. Silk responds to rhythm. Hands stay steady. Light joke number 2 lands quietly when someone says, "The silk sings better than they do," which earns a smile and keeps the chant going anyway. There are lucky days and unlucky days. Silk begun on the wrong day may unravel later, even if it looks fine at first. You realize these beliefs create a calendar, a structure to time that's felt rather than counted. Mainstream historians note that nomadic ritual calendars often aligned with ecological cycles rather than fixed dates, and silk work fits neatly into that system. You don't weave against the world, you weave with it. You notice protective behavior around finished silk. It's lifted over thresholds, never dragged. It doesn't touch bare ground unnecessarily. Children are warned not to step over it. These gestures aren't dramatic, but they're consistent. Historians still argue whether such practices originated from respect for labor, fear of contamination, or cosmological ideas about purity, but watching how automatic the movements are, you realize the belief has sunk into muscle memory. There's fear, too. Silk attracts envy. Envy attracts harm. Some people deliberately dull their finest silk with dust before travel, hiding brightness until it's safe. Light joke number 3 lands when someone says, "Silk shines like gossip. It spreads fast and causes trouble," which feels uncomfortably accurate. Silk is protected not just from physical damage, but from attention. Rituals also govern endings. Cutting silk for the final time involves pauses, sometimes words spoken under breath. You never cut across a major motif unless you absolutely must, and if you do, you apologize. Yes, to fabric. Historians still argue whether this anthropomorphism reflects animistic belief or simply deep respect for labor, but you catch yourself feeling relieved when the apology is made. Something about closure matters. As the fire burns low, these rituals soften. They're not heavy-handed. They don't demand belief so much as participation. Even skeptics follow them, because following them keeps peace. Silk, again, becomes a social stabilizer. It gives everyone something to agree on, even if they disagree about why. Eventually, conversation thins. The silk is folded one last time for the night, placed where it can rest.
That's the word used. Rest. Not storage. Not hiding. Silk, like people, needs rest to last. You lie back and listen to the step breathe. The rituals don't feel oppressive. They feel like guardrails, keeping something fragile intact in a world that rarely slows down. Silk survives not just because of skill, but because of care wrapped in belief, belief wrapped in habit. And as sleep edges closer, you realize these superstitions aren't about controlling silk at all. They're about controlling attention, patience, respect. Silk is just the teacher everyone agrees to listen to.
Something tightens in the air before anyone names it. Routes feel less flexible. Conversations linger on borders, on permits, on soldiers where there used to be scouts. Silk is still here, but it's handled differently now, more carefully, more defensively. This is the pressure point. Mainstream history is blunt about it. As large empires expanded across Central Asia, nomadic mobility was increasingly restricted, and with it, the systems that kept nomadic silk traditions alive began to fray. You feel the change first in time. Journeys take longer, detours multiply. Where silk once moved freely with people, it now waits, sometimes too long. Settled states want silk counted, taxed, standardized. They want fixed workshops, predictable output, repeatable patterns. Nomadic silk resists all of that by nature. Historians still argue whether the decline of nomadic silk traditions was driven more by political restriction or economic competition from mechanized production, but standing here, you can feel both forces pressing at once. A hard historical fact settles in. By the late medieval and early modern periods, centralized empires and later colonial administrations actively discouraged or dismantled mobile production systems, favoring urban manufactories that could be monitored and taxed. Silk weaving moved behind walls. The loom stopped traveling. For nomads, this wasn't just an economic shift, it was cultural amputation. Factories arrive with promises, faster output, cheaper cloth, consistent quality, and they deliver to a point. But silk made this way loses something. You notice it immediately. Patterns flatten, colors stabilize in ways that feel almost bored. Light joke number 1 slips in when someone mutters that factory silk looks like it's already tired, which earns a quiet chuckle, because everyone knows exactly what that means. Nomads adapt, of course. Some sell raw silk or undyed cloth to urban markets. Others switch fibers entirely. Wool and felt surge back into dominance because they can't be industrialized as easily, not yet. Silk becomes occasional, ceremonial, symbolic rather than everyday. Historians still argue whether this shift represents loss or strategic retreat, and the answer probably depends on who survived comfortably and who didn't. Borders harden. Movement requires permission. Portable looms become suspicious objects, unregistered production tools in an age that prefers paperwork. Silk patterns once read as identity markers are suddenly read as ethnicity, then as liability. You feel that danger creep in. Light joke number 2 lands uneasily when someone says silk used to get you recognized, now it gets you noticed, and nobody laughs quite right. Knowledge transmission breaks first. When weaving pauses too long, hands forget. When rituals aren't practiced, their timing slips. Children grow up seeing silk only in markets, not on looms. Mainstream historians agree that intangible heritage, skills, rhythms, embodied knowledge, is far more fragile than physical objects. You can store silk for centuries. You can lose the ability to make it in one generation. There's grief here, but it's quiet. No one announces an ending. Traditions just thin out. A pattern no longer woven. A dye recipe no longer needed. A loom left folded permanently. Historians still argue whether nomadic silk traditions truly disappeared or simply went dormant, absorbed into other forms, and that distinction matters. Dormant things can wake up. Light joke number 3 arrives softly when someone says silk doesn't like being told where it's allowed to go, which feels both funny and painfully accurate. Silk thrived on movement. Restrict movement and the thread snaps, not physically, but culturally. By now, silk feels heavier, not because of weight, but because of what it carries, memory under pressure. You sense how quickly centuries of refinement can be undone by a few decades of forced stillness. And yet even here, silk hasn't vanished completely. It lingers in wedding garments, in heirloom strips pulled out only on important days, in patterns remembered even when hands can no longer produce them perfectly. As night settles, you understand this section isn't about failure, it's about collision. Mobile tradition meets fixed power, hand skill meets machine speed. Silk doesn't lose because it's weak, it loses because the rules change. But rules, as you've learned by now, are never permanent. You notice the change not in museums first, but in hands. Younger hands, curious hands. Silk returns quietly, not as dominance, not as empire-fueled luxury, but as recovery. Mainstream history notes a late 20th and early 21st century revival of traditional crafts across Central Asia, driven by post-imperial identity shifts, tourism, and cultural preservation efforts. But standing here, you feel it's less about preservation and more about remembering how to breathe again. The loom reappears, sometimes reconstructed from old descriptions, sometimes copied from a grandmother's memory that surprises everyone by still being exact. It's portable again, even when it doesn't strictly need to be. That portability is symbolic. Silk wants motion. Modern roads replace caravan paths, but the instinct remains. Historians still argue whether contemporary revival weaving counts as continuous tradition or modern reinterpretation, and the people doing the weaving don't seem especially invested in the argument. They're busy making threat behave. A concrete historical anchor slips in. UNESCO and regional cultural programs have formally recognized several Central Asian textile traditions, including silk techniques, as intangible cultural heritage. That recognition brings funding, visibility, and rules. Rules are helpful. Rules are also suspicious. You feel the old tension return. Silk doesn't like being boxed in, even when the box is labeled heritage. Colors come back first. Not exactly the same, but close enough to feel familiar. Natural dyes regain popularity, not because they're efficient, but because they reconnect people to land. Madder roots are dug again. Insects are gathered again. Someone complains, light joke number 1, that natural dye takes forever, which earns a response that silk has waited centuries. It can wait a few weeks more. Fair point. Patterns follow. Old motifs resurface from photographs, fragments, oral descriptions. Some are guessed at, some are reinvented. Purists frown. Weavers shrug. Historians still argue whether accuracy should outweigh continuity in revival traditions, and silk, predictably, sides with continuity. A living pattern that's slightly wrong still lives. A perfect pattern no one weaves is just decoration. Women step forward again, not reclaiming power so much as resuming it. Silk revival projects often center female artisans, sometimes for the first time being publicly acknowledged as culture bearers rather than helpers. Mainstream scholarship supports this shift, noting that revival movements often expose gendered labor that was always there but rarely named. Silk becomes a platform, not a pedestal. Markets change too. Silk now moves through galleries, online shops, curated fairs. This is different pressure. Customers want stories, labels, authenticity certificates. Light joke number 2 lands when someone says silk now needs paperwork again, and everyone groans because history is looping a little too neatly. But adaptability returns. Stories are told, context is explained. Silk learns a new language. There's tension around commercialization. Some fear dilution, others see survival. Historians still argue whether market integration ultimately protects or erodes traditional crafts, and the answer, again, depends on who controls the terms. When weavers set prices, timelines, and limits, silk stays honest. When speed takes over, it starts to look tired again. You notice young people listening differently. They don't inherit silk by default. They choose it. That choice matters. Choosing slowness in a fast world is a statement. Choosing hand skill over automation is resistance, even if it doesn't wave a banner. Silk becomes a way to opt out, just a little. Light joke number 3 drifts in when someone says learning silk weaving is a great way to develop patience and a terrible way to make money quickly, which feels like the most accurate job description imaginable. And yet, people keep coming back, because silk still teaches the same lessons it always did: attention, timing, restraint, respect. The old debates don't vanish. Historians still argue whether revived pneumatic silk can ever fully reconnect with its mobile roots in largely settled societies. But watching someone roll up a loom, load it into a car, and drive out to weave under open sky anyway, you realize reconnection doesn't require perfection. It requires intention. Silk today doesn't pretend nothing was lost. It carries the gaps openly, missing patterns, broken lineages, interrupted songs. But it also carries resilience, the knowledge that thread can be picked up again, that hands remember more than we think, that movement doesn't always mean distance. It can mean returning. As the last silk of the day is folded, you feel the full arc settle. Not a neat ending, not a tragedy, not a triumph, just continuation. Silk from the steppe has always survived by adapting, without forgetting itself. That hasn't changed. And as you step back from the loom, from the thread, from the long road woven through centuries, you understand something simple and steady. Traditions don't die when they stop being visible. They die when no one feels them anymore.